Hi. Happy Sunday, June 25th. It is story time with Dr. Bird. I am doing a series of videos for the month of June where I'm reading through passages in the Bible that talk about sex, the relationship we call marriage. I put this in air quotes because what we call marriage looks very different from what the people in the Bible called marriage. And any sort of story that touches on physical harm or abuse that's related to intimate body parts. I do not like calling it sexual assault because I think that is just, you don't want to qualify assault with sexual. That sex is a positive thing, and I don't want to use it in a negative way. That's my thing. So anyway, so that's what I'm doing. And let's just jump into story time today. I started working through the book of the Gospel of Matthew. So I'm going to continue working through Matthew to touch on the stories that I think are most relevant. And um, so we talked about the genealogy the other day. We talked about the rest of this birth narrative in Matthew. And now we're going to skip over. I was looking through the in between chapters, and I don't think there's anything that pertains to my particular lens or focus for this series. So now we're going to talk about what the commands are, or the comments from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. I want to say a couple things first, and that is about having an informed understanding of what the Gospels are. It's interesting. I'm having some exchanges right now with people. One in particular who it's just really fun to banter with. But what's interesting is how much all of these ideas, what's interesting to me is how much all these different ideas gets really jumbled. And there's a difference, in my opinion, in trying to talk about this, a possible historical person that this might be connected to. We could refer to him as Jesus, and he was maybe born in Nazareth and lived in the region of Galilee, and grew up during a time of incredible financial exploitation for the people because of the taxation and the way that shifted from being collected by Rome to being collected by their own Jewish leaders. And so that's a reality that we need to, I think, give a nod to or acknowledge. But then from my perspective, that then informs who Jesus was and what he was up to, which is utterly separate from what Paul did in taking the execution of a Jewish man and making it somehow salvific for Gentiles. Like these are almost mutually exclusive realms of thought. And so it becomes really, really tricky. How do you make sense of then the gospel stories, for instance? Because the full on legitimate, honest to goodness letters written by Paul and his buddies come first, and then we get the first four canonical gospels, and then in the mix somewhere the other letters attributed to Paul come in. But it makes what we see in the gospels just, I think you need to add a layer or two of critical thinking and maybe questioning in terms of, to what extent is this historically reliable, or is this part of the story that we're trying to tell now? Um, I, I don't want to make this about being an intro course to the Newer Testament. I kind of can't help myself a little bit, and kind of putting some of those bits into this. But um, I think it really, any of, any of these studies will tell you about the people leading the study, right? Um, it was Albert Schweitzer that I know of who, kind of wrote it and had it published first, 120 years ago, whatever, that the search for the historical Jesus is like looking down into a well. The version of Jesus that you find down there is going to look a lot like who you are. And I think that is absolutely true. And I think that also applies to how you interpret any part of the scriptures, if you're going to engage this collection called the Bible, because these are stories and things associated with the issues most central to people's lives. So it makes sense to me that who we are or who we've been taught to be in this realm of things is going to be reflected in the way we engage the scriptures. And that if we start to see a version of events that's different from what we've been taught, that's going to feel like some sort of internal dissonance, right? If we start to see some things going on in scripture that we haven't seen before or that challenge the way we've been taught to see them, right? That's going to feel like internal dissonance because it is. All kinds of things going on here. So what I'm interested in doing and the way that I come at any of the scriptures in the Newer Testament, I prefer to call them the Hebrew Bible and Newer Testament, um, is what do these scriptures tell us about the people at the time, whether it was Jesus saying them or not. And I'm fine to just roll with this idea that Jesus said it. It's all being attributed to him, whether or not he did say it, right? His name and the idea of him have become a placeholder for all of these ideas and beliefs. So what I'm interested in talking about today is I'm interested in talking about the passages related to divorce, and therefore it touches on this concept of adultery. There are 3 different passages in Matthew's gospel alone where that becomes a topic, which is interesting in and of itself, if you ask me. So we'll read those 3 passages. They are not long, and combined, they are still not long. And also read briefly the Hebrew Bible reference that's involved. Okay, so in this conversation. So I think that's all I need to say up front. When I look at the Gospels, I'm not necessarily thinking that Jesus actually said all these things. I am thinking that whoever it is that said it doesn't matter to me as much as the fact that it's written down and collected and passed along. It tells us something about the people who wrote it down and passed it along, right? And it is therefore continuing to inform faith communities in particular. And what struck me pretty deeply as over the last 10 years, 10 or 11 years, as I've been working on this topic of marriage in the Bible, are the things in particular, because I come from a Christian upbringing, right? I'm coming at this from this whole Christian realm, and I look at the culture I live in and the political leaders who help to run this country, and they are predominantly, but not only, but predominantly informed by Christian backgrounds, right? So I care about what people are taught to think about these topics, marriage, or in this case, marriage and divorce and maybe adultery, based on what they think their scriptures tell them, right? And when we look at what Jesus is attributed with saying here, but we look at the premise undergirding the claims, what you see to me was it was really shocking for me to come to terms with it and be honest about it. To be honest about what's being attributed to Jesus or written by Paul on this topic of marriage and divorce in this case. It was stunning to me. I had to come to terms with the fact that Jesus is behaving like like any other Jewish man of the first century. He's not actually promoting ideas that I would encourage people to continue promoting. So even well into my scholarly years, I still kind of held on to this idea of Jesus being a little bit different or special, or maybe at least within the realm of more progressive rabbis or something. I had already kind of let go of some sort of divine element, but I think that upbringing still had an influence. And so it was actually really hard for me to see that Jesus is endorsing ideas that are really harmful to women in these conversations about divorce and adultery. So, there is a chapter in my book actually on this particular issue that is worth you knowing about, worth you knowing about, worth considering. There's a chapter on Matthew 19 verses 4-6, which is one of the biblical marriage passages, but I look at the whole section that we're going to talk about today. Okay. So So there the passages in Matthew that are relevant are there are 2 back to back in the chapter 5 of Matthew. So chapters 5, 6, and 7 are colloquially referred to as the Sermon on the Mount, and they are ideas that come from the Jewish law that Jesus is endorsing, and sometimes he takes it up a notch or 2 or 5, right? Very hyperbolic kinds of claims. This is the section that has, that whole like gouge your eye out if it causes you to sin, and cut your hand off if it causes cut your right hand off if it causes you to sin. Um, your right hand, right? For non-southpaws, if you masturbate with your right hand, cut that thing off. It really took me I don't know how old I was before I realized that was probably what that's a reference to. I thought it was just some random, I don't know, stealing. I don't know. I never really thought about it. Oh, that actually makes sense. If you've been told that it's a bad thing, you might. Anyway, okay. So Matthew chapter 5 has 2 verses, and then Matthew chapter 19 revisits this issue. So we'll read all passages together here. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, quote, "You shall not commit adultery," end quote. But I say to you, so here's the premise from the Jewish law, right? No adultery is number 7 in the way I was taught to number them. Murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and coveting are 6 through 10 in the way I was taught to number them. It's a little bit different in other traditions. But so you've heard it say, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, so now Jesus is going to take the Jewish law and ratchet it up a bit, or quite a lot, depending on how you want to look at things, right? Everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay? Hyperbole, right? Also, a lot of shame can go along with this way of thinking if you're going to take it at face value. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. I do talk about this in the chapter on Matthew 19 in the book, because I think it's important to have some context. The Matthean Jesus is the one that does this, kind of ratchets things up quite a bit. And people, I see people mocking each other on Twitter about men having an issue with women wearing revealing clothing in gyms, working out, and all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to dive into those. I'm not going to wade into those waters. I think it's more complicated than some people think. But and then some people will say, well, then just cut your eye, gouge your eye out, like get over yourself. I'm like, okay, they are being flippant when they say that, right? They're being flippant. Just like Jesus is being kind of flippant and over the top to make a point. But we don't actually tell people to cut off hands or actually gouge their eyes out, do we? I mean, we don't actually expect people to do that. It's hyperbole. But we don't apply the same level of hyperbole in our understanding of the first part about if you've lusted after a woman, you've already committed adultery. People actually apply that a little bit more literally, right? Which causes so much shame, and also becomes a thing where it's hard not to start to lust when you're told not to. I mean, I'm just saying in general. I don't, like, let's talk about it honestly instead, right? You see a human who's very attractive to you, and if your thoughts start to go down a certain pathway, right, where does that lead? And what are you doing with it? Are you objectifying that person? Are you actually valuing that person? Like, I think there's an honest conversation to have there instead of shaming people over lust. I mean, you don't have to agree with me, but do you see my point? Okay. So what is utterly, like, it just, oh my gosh, so many pieces of this conversation just make me so sad, because we know that cutting off the hand is hyperbole. We don't quite apply the same level of hyperbole to the whole shaming people over lusting, and I think maybe we should, right? Stop shaming people and let's talk about it honestly. And then when we get to this next piece, the very next couple of verses that's reiterated in 19. So verse 31, in continuing in this, it doesn't mean that Jesus said all these things all at the same time, standing up there on a mountain, right? I don't think that makes sense either, but it's a compilation of ideas, right? It was also said, quote, whoever divorces his woman, my English says wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce, end quote. That's from Deuteronomy 24. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his woman, not his wife, my English says wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries, it's Mary in the Greek, a divorced woman commits adultery. Okay. I want to keep reading and go over to 19, chapter 19, because it's the same premise, but I just want to kind of hold all these things together, right? So, whoever divorces his woman, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's Deuteronomy 24. And then Jesus takes it up a notch or five, right? And says, but I say, if you divorce, right, you're going to cause that woman to commit adultery because we're all assuming that people aren't going to remain single, right? That you kind of need, for survival's sake at the very least, you kind of need to repair up. Okay. So this premise is if you're married once and you separate, you're both eventually going to go remarry. And in chapter 5, it's the woman who's responsible for the adultery causing. In chapter 19, it's interesting to me. In chapter 19, it's a mutual. It's either person is going to, it's just talked about slightly differently. I don't want to make a big deal of it, but I do want to read it with you. So, chapter 19 of the same Gospel of Matthew. Some Pharisees came to him and to test him. So, Pharisees came to him and to test him. Pharisees are men who know the law well, know the Jewish law well. Okay. And so they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And he answered, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning, quote, made them male and female, which is a reference to Genesis 1:20, Genesis 1, the first creation story, when God creates male and female at the same time, and said, quote, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his woman. My English says wife, it should say woman, and the two shall become one flesh, end quote. Have you not read these two passages in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? I feel like I'm going to get confusing and out of order here. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. They've been joined together, according to that verse. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. End of Jesus's first comment. Okay. But hang with me. Let me do it as we go. One of the things that I did not realize until graduate school is that Jesus didn't make this up. They pose a question to him, because this is a debate that men have, or people have, and predominantly men. And he responds to it in the way that he knows the debate tends to go. It's not like Jesus is the first person to think of this. It's not like these Pharisees are the first men to think of this. This is a debate that's been going on for several hundred years that we know of for sure, because it was written down. So long predating these folks, right? These ideas had been trotted out and made claims like, this is what's being said. This is about marriage. So he's just playing along with the conversation that he knows is already taking place out there. He hasn't contributed anything new yet, which I think is really important for you to note. Okay. So then they respond to him with this comment of, therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. It's an interesting claim to say that two people coming together in the act of having sex is God joining them together. That is a really interesting claim to make. I just think I need to point that out. Then the Pharisees say to him, why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? Right? And he said, no. It was because you, which gets into this whole other conversation I don't want to dive into here, but there's an interesting separation of himself from his Jewish roots that this comment seems to imply. It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your women, my English says wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, so this is a form of Jesus, what he's commending, which is what he commended in chapter 5. Whoever divorces his woman, my English says wife, except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. So now he's saying anyone, right? It's you divorce, and it's not just the woman who's going to cause people but you are both potentially going to commit adultery, which is kind of what he says in some summation in chapter 5. Here's the thing. This isn't where the conversation ends. Okay. It keeps going. Verse 10, his disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his woman, my English says wife, man with his woman, it is better not to marry. As in, if divorcing isn't really such a great idea, according to you, because divorcing and remarrying will be committing adultery, then let's not marry to begin with. And Jesus does not seems to confirm their concern. He says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. And he goes on. And here's the thing, folks. This is what's new in this exchange here in chapter 19. There are eunuchs who have been so from birth. A eunuch is a castrated man. So eunuchs who've been so from birth, so born without testes. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, so captured in war and cut the jewels off, but we still want you, you're still, we'll use you for your strength or your wisdom or whatever, right? And you're safer to have around women because you're not going to get our women pregnant, right? Prego. So there are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Okay, first of all, there were men making themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. There were some early church fathers, it is rumored, after this, did castrate themselves. We could have a long conversation about why someone would do that. I would suggest it starts with some pretty strong body negativity as well as sex negativity. And I prefer to be sex positive, but also very well informed and grounded about it all. Okay, so and there were men making themselves eunuchs for several hundred years. And in fact, I mean, when he said, let anyone accept this who can, it seems to me that on a certain level and in a certain mindset, you might actually have an issue with men actually getting carried away with this. And in fact, as I said on a different time, I don't know if it was in this series or elsewhere, but it's a thing. The very first council that was called ecumenical council, meaning men from around the Mediterranean world, so the men from the Roman Empire were called together to get together to make a decision, to decide about this whole Jesus as God thing. And it was the emperor who called the first council. He was really afraid that this theological idea was going to split his empire. That's precisely what it actually did end up happening, but much farther down the road. So he, for political unification, right, political unity, or the unity of his empire's sake, called the first council of the church. I just think that is so fascinating, right? The implications there. That was in 325. The very first premise, the very first issue they decide to address in the list of things that came out of that very, very first conversation that was called to order in 325 in the town of Nicaea. I've actually been to that church, which is kind of fun. I don't know. I might not be a fan of all the ideas they came up with, but it is kind of fun to be in those places. Really important ideas were decided in this space. I don't know. It's now called Bursa, by the way, but Nicaea. The very first issue they decided to address was this issue of men castrating themselves. And they basically said, men, stop it. You guys are you're getting carried away. It's not helpful. We need you to populate our church as well as the empire. So it's not metaphorical first is my point here. It's not being taken as symbolic. It's actually literally happening. Men are actually doing this to themselves. Um, so so let's sit here for a minute. Okay. He makes the comment in that Beatitudes, it's attributed to him there, the same basic premise as what we see here. So what is important to me about this whole thing is why is divorce put on say why is Jesus saying if you divorce you're going to commit adultery? What's the premise underlying that claim? Okay. And I also want to read the Deuteronomy passage. And so I'm going to do that first. We'll do Deuteronomy 24 very briefly, just so you can hear it read. And then I want to make sure you understand the ideas at stake here, like where all this is coming from. So here's the passage in Deuteronomy 24 that's talking about when a man gives a woman a certificate of divorce. Okay. Chapter 24. Suppose a man enters. I'm sorry, I haven't looked at the Hebrew recently. And so takes a woman is what I'm assuming the Hebrew says here. My English says enters into marriage with a woman, but that's not possible in terms of what the Hebrew's saying. So I'm assuming suppose a man takes a woman. Maybe I should look it up real quick since it's at the beginning of the chapter. It'll be easy to find. Deuteronomy. Sorry, let me just do that real quick. I will feel better. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy 24, very beginning. 24. Ki yakach. Yeah, a man takes a woman. Isha. Yeah. Yeah. So a man takes a woman, not enters into marriage, but takes a woman. But she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. We could have a very long conversation about that, but we're not going to. And so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. There is a comment to be made here in terms of something objectionable about her, because that's one of the comments that comes up. Whether it is being satirical or not, I don't think matters. There's a reference to Jewish men in the first century divorcing their women because they just keep burning the dinner, kind of a thing, instead of for, whatever reasons, but for fairly benign or get over yourself and why don't you get in the kitchen and cook instead kinds of reasons. But not that would be happening in the first century. Okay. Or in the ancient world. So puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Then she leaves his house and goes off to be taken by another man. My English says become another man's wife, but I know that's not what it says in the Hebrew. Then suppose the second man dislikes her, writes her a bill of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Or the second man who marries her dies, one of the two. She is now on her own again, essentially. Her first man, my English says husband, who sent her away, is not permitted to take her again to be his woman, my English says wife, after she's been defiled. Did you hear that? Like, a man has taken her. They've had sex for a while. He gets rid of her. Someone else takes her, marks her as his territory. So she is now defiled in terms of any other man having her. Just sit with that for a minute. Her first man who sent her away is not permitted to take her again to be his woman after she's been defiled. For that would be abhorrent to the Lord. And you shall not bring guilt on the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. The fact that they combine in this claim the defiling of a woman as in very close connection to this issue about the possession of the land, possessing women, possessing land, men possessing things, marking their territory, claiming things as their own. and all of these things that end up being personified in a way as female, right? The land is female, a woman is a female, boats and cars and ships and things are female. But the connection between women as potentially defiled and the land as potentially defiled is a common thread actually in the Hebrew Bible, worth noting, and we will not dwell on that for today. Also interesting is the very next verse in Deuteronomy. I just can't help myself. When a man has recently taken a woman, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any related duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with the woman, my English says wife, whom he has taken. My English says married. Yeah, all kinds of things there. So we have in Deuteronomy this allowing a man to divorce, to send away a woman who he's not pleased with. And there are other passages that talk about that, like after the very first night of a marriage, that of sending her away because he doesn't please her, or she doesn't please him. Apparently she's not good in bed yet. I don't know. Imagine that the first time you have sex, you don't really know what you're doing. Anyway, so back to 19. Glad I still have a left hand. I just looked over in the comments and saw that. That's just funny. Like that was from a long time ago, but I just saw that. Okay. So here's what I want to highlight for you folks. Jesus, whether or not he said it, it's being attributed to him, right? And what's being attributed to him is this basic premise that having sex with someone makes, in their mindset, a man having sex with a woman means she belongs to him. That is a way that he claims her. And by the time we get to the first century, there's a little bit of evening out, but it's really just this claim that when you've had sex, that person belongs to you, and it's all male dominated in terms of the framework, right? So a man's had sex with a woman, she's his, he has taken her, she is his. You don't get to separate because you're going to go have sex with someone else, which means you're going to be cheating on that first marriage. You can't divorce her because she's going to go be remarried because that's really the only way she can survive. And let's face it, it works better for men as well to have a partner running things. You're going to go remarry. And so the underlying premise here in all of these passages is that remarrying is a form of cheating on the first marriage. What is really interesting to me is that I am aware, as I'm saying this, that for some people, it's going to be hard to hear why what I'm saying is so crazy, because it is the way people have been taught to think about it. You can't marry and you can't get divorced. Well, why not? Because you're going to go remarry, and you can't do that to your what? Do people even know? That's the question. Are people even aware of what's going on when they have this negative valuation of divorce? Do people even know, biblically speaking, why divorce is being declaimed as a problem? Divorce is being claimed as a problem, biblically speaking, because women are property and men claim women. The reason adultery is a problem is because adultery is when a man has sex with someone else's property, a woman who belongs to someone else. The man who has, so we have a marriage, okay? We got these two people over here are married, and here's the woman, and this other dude from over here comes over and has sex with her. This dude, it doesn't matter if he's married or not. The issue is she belongs to this guy over here. That was a weird little demonstration. I was trying to figure out how to do a visual on the fly. Are you tracking though? The reason adultery is a problem is for paternity issues, knowing who the child might be of these two people. So you don't get to go have sex with someone else's woman, because that might confuse things, but it also becomes territorial, and she's my woman. You don't tap that, right? I actually find using that ridiculous euphemism helpful, because it highlights how objectifying this whole language, this whole framework is in terms of women. This is about so let's just be very clear. The reason, sorry, I need to write something down. So the reason that the reason that adultery is a problem, biblically speaking, is women's bodies are are things that men own. And a man having sex with someone else's woman is an insult to that other man. She belongs to someone else. The reason divorce is a problem, biblically speaking, is because of this belief that men get to claim that that this woman belongs to him. I'm not saying it as succinctly as I said it in my head somehow. Biblically speaking, the reason divorce is a problem is because you're going to commit adultery on that first marriage. What is adultery, biblically speaking? It's when a man has sex with someone else's property. All of this, all of the ideas here are focused on the woman's body as property. So that when we talk about sex in some sort of way, it's a man doing a thing to another human. It's a man having sex with a woman. He does it to her, claims her. Oh, she already belongs to someone. Oh, you've offended the man. Or it's a problem because we don't want to get the children confused. Men do sex to subordinate people in biblical times, in biblical texts, in the world that the biblical texts come from. Sex is a thing dominant men do to subordinate people. And that is what we're seeing Jesus underscoring here. He's ratcheting it up and saying that. He's making it very clear that he is operating out of a worldview that sees women's bodies as things to be claimed and owned by men, territory to be marked and claimed. And since you've done that, you don't get to separate that and let her go be someone else's property. That's a full-on territorial mindset of ownership of women's bodies. So the only reason that divorce is a problem today for most people in the Christian tradition is because of this passage where Jesus is operating out of this very deep and thick view of women as bodies to be owned by men. And I'm just not in favor of that. And I think that premise needs to be dismantled. But people aren't aware that that's why they're told that divorce is a problem. They're just told that divorce is a problem. And so there's this negative valuation on divorce itself, period, for no reason that they're aware of, except you just don't do it. So there's guilt and shame around that. When in those situations when people are usually seeking a divorce, it's for really good reasons most of the time. It's not for petty reasons like he won't mow the yard or she's burnt dinner too many times. It's not usually for those reasons. So we have this ancient view of women as bodies to be owned that is informing this idea that you should not divorce. And it's coming out of Jesus' mouth. So it doesn't matter his reason for it because he's God incarnate, according to the Christian tradition. And so we don't need to question why. We just know that he said it. Therefore, it's true for all time. And we're going to tell people they can't get divorced instead of understanding why he said that, which is coming out of really jacked up views of human bodies, women in particular. Am I making sense? Did that all make sense somehow? Divorced and put away, yes, it's the same thing in this context. Yes, when a man writes a certificate of divorce and puts her away from him, sends her away. Yeah, don't smash other people's property. Exactly. For those of you who don't know, smash is one way to euphemistically refer to have sex with. Okay. These guys writing the rules lacked imagination. I mean, there's that too. Okay. There's that too. And it's it makes me cringe when I start to think about it in terms of how blatantly objectifying it is of women, but ultimately then also of men. I mean, it's of humanity. It really actually seeps into everything, right? You can buy a woman for some goats. You could as well sell her on for a few cows. Why not make that the rule? I mean, right. But the thing is, we're not conscious of this underlying set of ideas that say why divorce is a problem when it's put into Jesus's mouth, right? So So when people so coming back to at least where I'm coming from with this whole conversation, I decided to try to tackle the topic of marriage in the Bible because I'd like people to be well informed on what the Bible is saying about these things first before you decide whether you want a biblical marriage or not. And Matthew 19, 4 to 6 is one of the passages that people turn to say, this is what a biblical marriage looks like. Well, verses 4 to 6 are just those three verses when Jesus said, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his woman, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. That's it. That's all that people are using, which is essentially reiterating Genesis 1 and 2, which are the first two passages in biblical marriage. Jesus adds this whole thing about therefore no divorcing. And so people just take that, therefore, this line, what God has joined together. So when you have sex with someone, that is God joining you two together. I mean, it's a really interesting claim if you think about it. That God is joining you together when you have sex with someone. And in a faith context, people have been taught to just agree with that and believe it and apply it. That two people deciding to have sex is God joining you together and making one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. That's a really powerful layer of belief right there. Are you tracking with my point here that two people having sex is two people having sex? But there's a claim made that God is joining them together as one. I am not on any level trying to deny that when two people come together, whether for sex or for long-term relationship, like that's a powerful thing. And I think it's really cool when two people do that and decide to do it for the long haul, and they have really cool family, they have children and families together, and they have community of people, and they're all interconnected, and they go through the long haul together. I think that's really amazing. And when those two people work well as a team, it shows. Like, I think that's all very cool stuff, right? I'm not challenging that. I'm challenging these claims that are being made in the name of God that are then used to shame people and put a layer of guilt onto people when they're in a relationship that they realize they for their own well-being, they need out of, right? That's what I care about, is when we so casually banter about these lines that are really powerful without thinking through what their implications are, without thinking through if that's really what's happening when two people have sex. Two people having sex is not the same thing as God joining two people into one. Or maybe it is, but then we need to have a little bit lighter grip on what's allowable. I don't know. Anyway, so people quote Matthew 19, 4 to 6 as defining biblical marriage, and they don't keep going and read the whole passage in which Jesus throws the gauntlet telling men to castrate themselves if they can handle it. That's biblical marriage. And what is important, what I've started trying to point out to people is this more full passage here, including the whole eunuchs thing. If a man is a eunuch, then he cannot procreate, right? And procreation is the very first verse, which is Genesis 1:28, when it says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That's the first one that people quote for defining biblical marriage, is being fruitful. But the third one that they quote is Matthew 19, 4 to 6. But if they read the full passage, it's Jesus telling men to be fruitful, which really fully undermines the first of the four biblical marriage passages. Did you track with that? Maybe I should do a visual for that. Right? Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19, 4 to 6, and Ephesians 5:31 and 32. Matthew 19, the fuller context, undermines the first passage. Also, in Genesis 1, God tells the fish of the sea and the birds of the air to be fruitful and multiply. And I don't think God is telling them to get married. I don't know. Anyway, Jesus on divorce and adultery is fully reflecting a an ancient Jewish and other people mindset on men, women, and forgive the binary, but that's what we're primarily talking about in these contexts. Men, women, sex, and marriage. Jesus is talking about adultery through the lenses he's been handed, which is his Jewish scriptures and tradition, which very much in the first century are still objectifying women as men's property. And he doesn't challenge that belief. He actually reifies it or reinforces it by these claims about why divorce is a problem. Divorce is a problem because we know that the two people just divorced are going to find new partners, and then you'll be committing adultery on that first marriage. It is a very, in my opinion, a very unhealthy way of talking about bodies and sex, much less long-term important relationships. I think I've said it a couple different times and ways. Yeah? Yeah, well, Justin Martyr may be one of the people who, I think is one of the people who's thought to have, castrated himself. I don't know if you all were talking about that. I just see one. Yeah, and there's a question there. Thunderbird raises a comment. Oh, the only divorce the Bible says is legitimate is as if another man is for unchastity, right? And so again, the premise or the given the context, the premise is that your woman has been unfaithful in some way, shape, or form. So some other man has had sex with your woman's had an affair, whatever. Yeah, that's right. So she's already broken that bond by having an affair with someone else, which is, which is interesting in and of itself, as if that, right. Anyway, um, anyway, it's worth noting that is what he's saying. It's also just still, it's just still very complicated. It's just so messy. So, I just don't think it's a helpful passage or set of passages to turn to. I think it's much better to just be honest about what the premise is for a Jewish man in the first century, and Jesus included, right? And Paul included. Right? This is a way for men to mark their territory. Women are still being highly objectified, even in the first century, in this context, in this conversation, right? That's what I wanted to say today. Okay. So thank you for being here. It's a Sunday. And there's some people showing up on a Sunday, people are often just playing and getting ready for the week or whatever. Or taking a day off or whatever. I'm just so pleased that some of you wanted to be here. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for watching this on replay. And I hope there's been something useful in this for you. I have to say, I really enjoy this. I would enjoy it more if we could be actually having a conversation amongst us, but this is what we have for now. So thank you. I hope there's something useful, and I will be back tomorrow, same time, same place.